Now we're going to hear from Sam. Sam's actually also a celebrity at York University and on the left. A lot of people come to York, to the poli-sci department, to learn from Sam and others. Let's see. Yes, his latest book, he's written many books, his latest is In and Out of Crisis, The Global Financial Meltdown and Left Alternatives. But for most of his life, actually, he was a labor activist, so that's his thing. And so, Sam Gindin.
My main claim to fame is actually that I hired Jim. I'm going to take quite a different tack. I'm going to ramble a bit, but the question I want to ask is, when we ask what happened to us over the last 30 years, we talk about all the things that they did to us. And what we don't talk enough about is, well, what were we doing all this time? Where were we? We're sitting in the greatest crisis we've seen since the 30s. And what happened in the 30s was the labor movement, in the middle of 25% unemployment, actually discovered a new form of organization, industrial unionism. And we have to ask ourselves, what's happening today? What new forms of organization are coming out of this crisis? And if I was honest, which I will be, I'd say that it's not even being discussed seriously in the labor movement. People are kind of hoping that if we just kind of stumble along, the bad times will disappear, or we have to try harder, or maybe these guys won't be quite as bad as they've been. And if we don't actually ask those really hard questions, which can be downers, but we have to ask them, if we're not sober about what we really face and our own limits, we're not going to change much. One of the things that was so exciting to me about Occupy is that Occupy actually called us on it. Occupy actually said, hey, take a look at this. Audacious and bold action matters. And it touches a nerve. And it wasn't good enough for the labor movement to say, well, that's great. We'll support your parties. It was important. That's very important. But what had to happen is that the labor movement had to take up that call. What we needed is workers to start occupying things. Somebody said to me, when a policeman dies, there's a mass demonstration in the city. When a worker dies on the job, nobody knows about it. Nobody would think of maybe stopping work and raising questions of health and safety. So I just want to start with posing that difficult question, and I'm going to talk more about it, and I want to raise a whole series of questions about it. But first, I just want to say a few things about some of the things we've been talking about around deficits. When we talk about deficits, one of the interesting things that comes out, if you look at the Tea Party, there's just a book done on this in the States. If you ask the question, do you support, these are people who are completely anti-government, right? If you ask them, do you support Medicare? Do you support old age security? The figures, it's 80% amongst people who consider themselves Tea Party support it. And it's not because they're hypocritical, or don't get it. It's because they have a view of who has a right to have access to social programs and who's undeserving. They have a sense that there's an undeserving poor and they don't deserve it because they aren't like us. So that's one dimension of it. The second dimension of the deficit that I want to stress is that even if we had no deficit anywhere, they'd be calling for privatization. Because what's happened over the years is that we built up publicly administered institutions in healthcare and education, and now these are potential, and municipal services, and now these are very potentially great sites for capital accumulation to make profit, especially right now when a lot of other sites have dried up. So one of the key things that's actually going on is privatization. Some of the largest, fastest growing corporations in the world today are corporations whose business it is to subcontract work from the public sector or take it completely over. So I'm just stressing that because erase all the deficits, we still have that problem. We still have this class question of power and control. The other thing that I want to raise is, and here I disagree with Jim, and it's a really crucial thing for us to think about, and that's how we think about finance. They're greedy, they're speculators, they're horrible people, but this is part of capitalism. And what I mean by that is that when we take a look at what's happening at CAT, this isn't a financial company. This is a company who has common interests with financial interests. When we look at capital generally, they want a strong financial sector. We didn't go through this crisis and see a lot of great corporations screaming about how banks created this crisis and they should be penalized. We want them to fix it. That's the call from the corporations because they need it. They want the cheap capital, which they've gotten over the last 30 years. If you have a global economy, you have to have a way of managing that risk, and that's what the financial markets do for them. In the United States, they're basically pulling in finance from around the world, including from poorer countries. It's part of capitalism. The problem with capitalism is that something like finance is necessary to it. That's one of the problems with capitalism. So we have to not think in terms of, if we just isolate finance, that the rest of it is good. We still have General Motors, we still have IBM, and we still have all the caterpillars. We're fighting capitalism, not just finance. They come together. This is crucial in terms of developing our strategies. Now, the main thing I want to say is, which I don't think we kind of throw it around, the word is there, we have to come to the grips with what we're facing and confronting is capitalism. This is what we're up against. It's a powerful system. And to change it isn't going to be changed by taking over a park. This is a massive organizational question that raises two things that we have to do immediately. I mean, as kind of a short-term project. We have to build up our capacities to fight the system. We don't actually have those capacities. We don't have it in the unions, we don't have it in the social movements, and we have to figure out how to do that. We have to be inspired by Occupy, but still recognize that Occupy is itself a protest movement that hasn't figured that out. So we have to figure out how do we build the capacities to do this.
Mic check.
So we're not going to do that. There's going to be a question and answer period.
Thank you.
Phew. Second of all, what we do have to get on, people have talked about getting alternatives on the agenda, and we really have to get alternatives discussed. And I mean big alternatives, not minor alternatives. It's great that that Ford was rolled back yesterday, but what it means, we shouldn't lower our expectations. What it means is that we're going to have slower cuts instead of no cuts. It's not about thinking about what kind of society we should have, what kind of services we need for everybody, how we expand, how we just have a richer, more democratic society. So we shouldn't be satisfied, and we have to think about how do we seriously put the discussion of an alternative to capitalism on the agenda. We haven't been able to do that for 30 years. There's some complaining, but we haven't been able to do that. George Carlin said, and he was talking about capitalism, he put it in terms of the American dream. He said the trouble with the American dream is you have to be asleep to believe it. And one of the great Occupy signs on Wall Street was to say, wake up America, and that's what they were talking about. Wake up from that dream nightmare. We have to take capitalism on. Okay, I want to raise 5 kinds of questions to think about in terms of what it might mean. First of all, for the labor movement. We've got a real contradiction in the labor movement. And the contradiction is that the trade union movement grew up on the basis of selling labor. That's what it does. It negotiates the price and conditions of labor. But if you ask workers what their greatest concern in life is, you'll find out that it's jobs. This is what concerns people today, even when the unemployment rate is low, because restructuring and insecurity is permanent. So the question is, how does the labor movement come to grips with this? Because if it doesn't, then it's not even able to deliver on the wages and the benefits, because it doesn't have the power to do it. But also, if it doesn't deliver on the question of jobs, it's just not going to be able to renew itself. And the question of jobs is going to have to mean taking on corporate power. You can't take on this thing and hope that, well, if we just stimulate the economy, that'll work, because the corporations are opposed to that. So you have to actually take on their power. What do we see for the last 30 years except that problem? So there has to be the taking on of corporate power, and it raises questions like, if they're closing plants, why aren't we talking about taking them over and converting them? Why aren't we talking about, why is planning not on the agenda anymore as opposed to competition? Why aren't we talking about, production for use? Why aren't we talking about converting all this great capacity that we have, this manufacturing base that we're losing, to providing the things for the environment that we all know there's going to be all kinds of changes in everything about our infrastructure, homes, factories, etc., over the next century. That's what we have to talk about, production for use, not-for-profits, and these are radical questions. Public sector. The public sector understands right now that it has to talk about the services. Otherwise, it's going to be isolated. The problem is that it's not good enough. People see that cynically. That's just rhetoric. What the public sector has to do is it has to say that we're going to put the negotiation of public services, their improvement in terms of quantity, the level, quality, and the administration of them on the bargaining table. That's a revolution for unions, but it's the kind of revolution that you have to think about. In the case of the municipal garbage workers, what should be on the agenda is that our only demand in bargaining is that we don't want it privatized. That's a demand that can protect their services, rather than just saying we want employment security. And employment security right now means that 40% of the workers don't have employment security, so they can immediately lay off 40% of the workforce. It doesn't save the jobs. So the public sector has to think that through, and then it has to think through, if we represent services, then what happens when there's a strike and we remove those services? Isn't that a contradiction? So they have to think creatively about, well, how would you conduct a strike so it shows which side you're on and you don't make enemies? One trade union leader suggested you have a work-in. Long-term health care, for example, the idea was, why don't we go into work rather than stay out and show the kind of services you could provide if we actually brought more people in? Why not try something like that? Why not transit workers not collecting fares, garbage workers dropping the garbage off on Bay Street to make a point about They're not picking it up in Forest Hill, but picking it up in other neighborhoods. There's a lot of creative things that workers have thought about over the years that you can address. A third point, organizing. The trade union movement, for the trade union movement, organizing is generally about membership. We're only going to be successful if it's about building the working class. In other words, globalization doesn't mean that everything's leaving. Most of our economy is now services. They're locked in here. They're here. Why wouldn't we try to organize the fast food chains through cooperation amongst unions? Well, you can't do that if you're competing between unions. But if you're thinking of building the working class, it becomes a possibility. There's all kinds of workers being laid off. Why aren't unions organizing those workers? Why aren't they bringing them into their union halls and showing them that there's a space for them where they can hang around, they won't be isolated, that you can organize them, you can do education, you can show films. If you can't organize your own members who are losing their jobs, you're not going to organize anybody else. Precarious workers. We talk a lot about precarious workers. First of all, we have to recognize that a lot of precarious workers are actually in unions. In Local 79 in the city, 40% of the workers are part-time workers. In the libraries, it's 50%. But there's a lot of people out there, obviously. During the Iraq demonstrations, the actual category that, in that massive demonstrations that were way back, I don't remember the date, it was high school students, precarious workers. It wasn't the usual student and labor crowd. So the question is, well, what forms might organize them? Should we form citywide structures or organizations? How does this relate to Occupy? How does this relate to the Workers' Assembly in Toronto that I'm part of? So we have to think about, well, what are we going to invent here? I mean, we have to discover these new forms of organization. What are they going to be? And that's the kind of discussion we have to have about that. Banks. Jim really emphasized the banks absolutely correctly. If we don't talk about taking on the banks, and by taking on the banks, I mean nationalizing them and making them into democratic. If we don't do that, we're not serious. That's the point I want to make. As long as you leave, the banks are treated like public utilities right now. They're just not democratic ones. If they're in trouble, you bail them out. They're seen as providing a service that is so important, you can't let them go under. Well, why not make them into democratic utilities? Because the banks are so crucial to the system because they impose discipline, as Jim was emphasizing, on companies, on workers. If we really want to do anything like convert things, like redistribute things, we have to have some control over the banking system. So being serious means that we start thinking about, well, what would that mean? It's not so easy, powerful, but it's also complicated. But it means we actually start having discussions about that. The fifth thing I want to raise, which is usually not raised at all, is one of the difficulties of getting workers involved is they actually don't have time. It used to be that the way you got time if you're an activist is that you got your wife to do everything else. That's over. So the question is, how do we deal with this question? How do we deal with the way we have meetings, How do we deal with taking on work time? How do we deal with the question of time? Because if you don't have time to think, to read, to learn, to strategize, and to act, you can't change society. Or you're waiting for somebody up there to change it for you. But it won't be the kind of change and transformation that people are here are talking about. Two final points. One thing that Linda emphasized a lot was the post-war period as a contrast, as a good capitalism compared to today. The problem is that it really is over. That capital reacted to that moment. You know, there was a moment when they said, we've got a strong labor movement, we need a social contract of some kind. If they just let us run the place, they let us run the factories, they let us make the key decisions, we'll agree to share some of it. Now, what they decided after a while is, first of all, they had pressures on them. They're going global, there's more competition, it's capitalism, you have to compete. Decided they can't afford this anymore. That workers who are secure, first of all, are a problem. They don't like the authoritarian characteristic of the workplace. They have high expectations. So capitalists are just not there anymore. There's now only one kind of capitalism. If you look around the world, there's differences. There's important differences. You can still fight to modify the tax system one way or the other. But basically, capitalism is moving in the same kind of direction everywhere. So the question isn't a better capitalism, but to really start thinking about, well, if we want to change it, and it's not going to happen in 10 or 15, I don't think 50 years, but that's what we have to take on. And on the way there, you're still fighting. You're still winning things. And as long as you're fighting, you're at least slowing down the losses. Now, I say that because one of the things that's happened to us is that anytime anybody raises a radical idea, it's seen that that's impractical. And the point I want to end on is that what's actually impractical now is moderate ideas. They don't work. It's not just that they're not revolutionary, it's that they don't actually work. And you know, that's what Tina was about. There was something to what Thatcher was saying. There is no alternative if you accept capitalism, and you accept its logic, and you accept its power structure, to actually make any significant changes. So where we're at is what's actually practical now is the radical. Thank you.